Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Fred Young, and I'm a member of the board of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted you're able to join us today for the second part of our four-part series. We hold these truths, perspectives on health disparities, racial identities, and cultural humility. A little bit about myself. In addition to being a trustee, I'm a professor of psychology, director of the Graduate Mental Health Counseling Program, and interim undergraduate psychology chair at SUNY Westbury in New York. I'm also a former president of the National Latinx Psychological Association and the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, as well as a former chair of the American Psychological Association Ethics Committee. Today's webinar, Systemic Racism in Psychology, National Ethnic Minority Psychological Association Perspectives, is being presented by Drs. Helen Su, Theopia Jackson, Aisha Ikizler, Andrea Romero, and Wendy Peters. I wanted to tell you what makes these women experts in the field. Dr. Helen Su is a past president of the Asian American Psychological Association and an advisory board member of the JED Foundation. She is lead clinician for outreach services and liaison to the Asian American Activity Center and lecturer at Stanford University. Dr. Su is a consultant and presenter nationwide on topics addressing youth and young adult mental health and culturally responsive interventions. Dr. Theopia Jackson is the 2019 to 2021 president for the Association of Black Psychologists. She's a licensed clinical psychologist who received her master's degrees in clinical psychology from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and her doctorate from the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. She has held several leadership roles in higher education and is currently chair of the clinical psychology degree program at Saybrook University. Dr. Jackson is a co-founder for the Therapist in Residency program, which is an African-centered program dedicated to supervising Black clinicians in training and providing services grounded in Black psychology for persons of African ancestry. Dr. Aisha Ikizler currently serves as president of the American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association and is an assistant professor of psychology at St. Mary's College of Maryland, a public liberal arts college. Her research focuses on the link between oppressive experiences and mental health outcomes amongst marginalized groups with a special interest in Arab MENA Americans, LGBTQ+ individuals, and intersectional identity development. Dr. Andrea Romero is president of the National Latinx Psychological Association. She is vice president for faculty affairs at the University of Arizona, where she is the lead administrator on faculty matters related to professional development, career advancement. She is also professor of family studies and human development in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and a faculty affiliate in psychology, Mexican American studies, gender and women's studies, Latin American studies, and public health. Dr. Wendy Peters is native Hawaiian and has been a member of the Society of Indian Psychologists Executive Council for the past 10 years. She has taught for Antioch University since 2010 and is a health and community psychologist. In addition to teaching, Dr. Peters has worked as a researcher in native health disparities and substance abuse. Her primary involvement is with American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and other underserved and marginalized populations. We're very fortunate to have them all with us today. We also need to let you know that all our presenters have declared that they have no conflicts of interest. Objective 1. Describe how systemic racism has and does impact all Americans with specific attention to the communities served by the respective associations. Objective 2, name at least 3 effective culturally centered responses promoted by the associations in countering the impact of systemic racism. Objective 3, identify strategies to dismantle systemic racism within the discipline of psychology and at community levels. So this second presentation in the 4-part We Hold These Truth series follows a very successful webinar that discussed trauma-informed practices to address health inequities in communities of color. We were encouraged by the interest and enthusiasm demonstrated by participants through their questions and comments. We hope to continue this momentum today. The ethnic minority associations have come together to share their challenges, strategies, and accomplishments in serving their members and communities during the dual crises of COVID-19 and systemic racism. We hope to pull back the curtain and allow webinar participants into the concerns, processes, and discussions that have been going on with these associations. As I share the screen with these 5 accomplished, strong, and respected women, all leaders in their associations and communities, it is not lost on me that according to several news sources, we have just elected our first woman as president, as vice president. That was my mistake. Wishful thinking.
Yes.
Kamala Harris, a woman of color, born of immigrant parents from India and Jamaica. This is a significant moment in this country's history, and our panels embody this. I'm grateful that you all chose to be here with us today to share your wisdom. And on a personal note, I want to offer you all much props, love, and respect for what you've done for our communities. So to begin, could you all just give us a short description of your associations for those people in the audience who might not be familiar with them? So Aisha, go ahead, Helen.
Right, I was like, are we going in the listening order? I'll start off. I'm Helen Soots. I'm from the Asian American Psychological Association. We are almost 50 years old and started in a hotel conference room at that time when it was realized among Asian American psychologists that there was not a place addressing our concerns. And we have specialty divisions because, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure, we're a very diverse group. And so we have sections for students on women, Filipino Americans, LGBTQ, Asian Americans, South Asians, practice, and multiple heritage and adoptees.
Thank you. Ethiopia?
Beautiful, thank you. First and foremost, I want to appreciate the Trust for hosting this conversation. And I also want to honor the esteemed panelists here, my phenomenal cultural scholar warriors as well, and all the work that they've been doing. And I want to bring blessings and greetings to you from the Association of Black Psychologists, which was founded in 1968. Before I say that, I would be remiss if I didn't take a personal space and say, I too am a Howard University graduate, so props to my dear sister in the White House now, and also on behalf of all the Delta Sigma Theta, giving props to our big sisters from Alpha Kappa Alpha. So we're well represented in terms of the lifting of Divine Nine and the space it's stepped into now. But getting back to the focus of this conversation. So the Association of Black Psychologists was born in 1968. First and foremost, we were clearly recognizing that psychology at that time was more than not recognizing our realities, but was actively playing a role in the miseducation of us about us, as well as the miseducation of others about us. And what I mean by that is simply the idea that when those of us who are direct descendants of those who were trafficked here in 1619, that 400 plus years is an intentionality of literally erasing all of who we are, our own values, our own consciousness and whatnot. And so we have been intentionally reclaiming that from a Sankofa experience, which means to kind of go back and fetch and move forward. So our mission is we're focused on the psychological liberation of people of African ancestry, the illumination of the African spirit, and the empowerment of the African character. So you can see in that mission statement that we are very clear about the centrality of our Africanness and the goodness of it. And I also am excited to claim that we were the first to step out and so boldly say that there is another way of being, another way of thinking, another psychology, and all should be here. And I'm happy to see my dear sister warriors in this moment, which is not falling short on me, the role of feminine energy in this time and space in the world's recovery and healing. So blessings and thank you for having us.
Dr. Kisler.
Oh my gosh, I was hoping that I wouldn't need to follow Dr. Jackson. I was just thinking as she was speaking that she's triggering all of my imposter syndrome right now. But anyway,
blessings, my dear sister, blessings.
But truly, I can't speak highly enough of my colleagues here today from the other ethnic minority psych associations, and especially AB Psy as the representative from the Arab, wait, let me get this right, the American, Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association, Amina Psy. You know, we're the new kids on the block. We actually only came into formal existence in 2017, and we're only on our second elected board currently. So we're really brand new to the Ethnic Minority Psych Association game. And so I don't think we could exist if it weren't for you all who came way before us. So I appreciate all of your work.
Thank you.
So for us, you know, many of us MENA psychologists. I use MENA as shorthand for Middle Eastern and North African. For MENA psychologists, we have been really absent from the psychological literature, from the conversations around race and ethnicity. And so part of the impetus of our development as an organization has come from needing to have more recognition of who we are as a people. And so our aim is to create a professional networking and community atmosphere, a home for MENA psychologists, as well as for students and psychologists who study MENA issues, even if they're not of MENA descent themselves. And we have sort of, I guess, informal branches or arms where we have a student committee that's actually, I think about half our membership is students right now, which is really exciting for our future. We have a research and education domain or area, and then a practice and applied area. And one thing that we're working on as an organization is to diversify the type of professionals and students that are represented in our group. Right now, we tend to lean heavily in the clinical counseling realm, but we would like to be able to serve and be useful to non-clinicians as well. And I should say we have an advocacy committee as well, and I'll probably talk about that a bit later.
Thank you. Dr. Romero.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to the Trust and to Dr. Fred Mian for inviting us to be here. I want to start with a land acknowledgement for the land that I'm on here in Tucson, Arizona. It's the ancestral homelands of the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui. It's always important for me to start with that because that acknowledges from the get-go the systemic racism and oppressive systems that have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And when I think about that, where Latinx psychology started, it really was more than 500 years ago, before the Spanish even came to the Americas at all, because the native people here, the Mexica, were engaging in psychological practice before they ever came. They were doing counseling practices, talk therapy, substance use prevention and intervention, and I could go on. But in more modern times, about in the 1970s, a group of psychologists came together and had the first Hispanic Psychology Conference. Out of that came a few different books and a loose collaboration of folks. But then we came together again about 20 years ago, and in 2002 became incorporated as a National Latinx Psychological Association. And we've grown quite a bit. We started as a relatively small group. I agree completely with Helen. We were in a small room at a large psychological conference and felt that we were not being represented, and that the mental health and the well-being of Latinx populations were not being well addressed within those larger spaces. And so for those reasons, we came together again right around 2000, became incorporated 2002, and since then have been active and growing. We have quite a few students. We are a group of mental health professionals who are generating and advancing knowledge and fostering effective application for the benefit of Latinx populations. Our mission is to be a supportive professional community that advances psychological education, training, science, practice, and organizational change for the health and well-being of Latinx populations. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Peters.
Wow. Well, I represent probably the smallest group of the organizations, which is the Society of Indian Psychologists. I will also start with a land acknowledgement, but since we are virtual and since I do represent the Society of Indian Psychologists, I will just respectfully say that I would like to acknowledge all the ancestors and the elders, the tribal nations and peoples of the Americas, all of those indigenous peoples, all of the native peoples of the United States and beyond. The Society of Indian Psychologists has been in existence for over 35 years, and we advocate for the mental well-being of Native peoples in the United States, but also beyond. We have membership that are comprised of Native psychologists and non-Native psychologists, students, social workers, other health practitioners, and we are an inclusive community, inviting anyone who is interested in allying with our communities, as we all value service in return to our communities. Our main objective as a society, as an organization, is to increase the knowledge and awareness of the issues that impact Native mental health and Native communities. Because we are such a small, Native people are in such small numbers and are so marginalized in this country, there are many misunderstandings and misconceptions with regard to Native people, reservations, treaties, our legal standing within the United States and beyond. And so we try to be as informative. Most of us are scholars. We are authors and teachers and practitioners, and we predominantly seek to serve the various Native communities of this country.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the Trust for inviting us all.
So we had asked the associations to consider this question: how do you conceptualize systemic racism and its implications for society and for your association? And how do you conceptualize why your association exists to counter these? We thought we'd start with a bit of a historical bent, talking about what's it been like to kind of be trained and to work within mainstream psychology. So if you all could feel free to field that question and we can begin our discussion.
May I say the nature of this question, Theopia, if you don't mind, I feel like with ABSI as the longest established would be a great place to start.
Blessings, of course, I accept that invitation. First and foremost, I want to give honor in recognizing that ABSI was born from both graduate students and professionals. That's an important place to start, because they recognize, as I said earlier, that our psychology was perpetuated what we now call the deficit model, where every research and theory was set up to compare Black and white folks, if you will. And each time when there was a difference, it was always interpreted as if something was wrong within the Black community. The way in which we thought about families, that it had to be the traditional heterosexual biological parenting, if you will, and yet within many of the Black communities, there were different types of family situations setting up. So people were not looking at the genuineness of the love that was being presented, but instead judging them on the character or the structure of how the family was set up. So it's also important to note too, when I think about this question of systemic racism, I clearly translated into a way of thinking and being, which is white supremacy ideology. That is a cultural value in and of itself. There are certain belief systems that are embedded in that. And it is that which has informed much of what's happening in the United States, as well as our psychology. Our psychology within the American Psychological Association is not colorblind. It too is born from Eurocentric values in terms of the prominence of the individual, the idea of needing to find something and fix it, if you will, and interpreting science that way. These are just short scripted examples in the midst of time, but to give clarity. So there is some value in that. And yet at the same time, like everything else, there is significant risk in it because you miss the fullness of the human experience for someone who doesn't fit in that alignment. An example I would give, again, within the Black community is a classic one. There was a study done by Carol Stack, I want to say in the early 70s, and this was a white social worker who had an opportunity to live among Black families in the quote ghetto on the projects of Chicago for a significant amount of time. And in what she noticed, understandably so, were these behaviors where each of the Black families tended to sort of act as if they were a family, even though they were not biologically or legally related. There was this perception that every time you sit down to dinner, there could be anybody's children there. So sharing what little they had, caring for each other, things of that nature. And these are genuinely wonderful behaviors. And yet she interpreted this as in result of a pushing back on oppression and poverty. It was not until our Black scholars who were so bold enough to say, how do we understand who we are from our own wisdom space? And that meant going back into Africa and studying the wisdom keepers there and asking, how does that make sense for us? That we now have a more genuine understanding of those behaviors, which is that there is a tendency among many people of African ancestry to act like family, no matter where they are, no matter what their social economic status is. And also this familial likeness sometimes crosses the limitations of race and ethnicity because there's a spiritedness, a connectedness that's there that people can love in a communal way. I also want to add, as we're moving forward, so in our Association of Black Psychology, we are so centered on who we are as people of African ancestry that we have integrated the village-like work within our professional scholarship. So we do have a long-standing 50+ years of science under this idea of Black psychology, but we should say Black psychologies because we're also recognizing that there are different ways of addressing this, yet we stay central on the mission statement I mentioned earlier. We are also engaged in conversations across the diaspora, and we talk about other African scholars around the world, and we're engaging in this Pan-African conversation. What does Pan-African psychology look like? Because once again, we're seeing a centrality going back to this issue of systemic racism, in the sense that it's as if there has been this idea that anything Black is wrong, and there's a lie of Black inferiority and a lie of white supremacy and superiority. And so that this lie has manifested itself all around the globe. It just shows up differently based on the context. The last piece I'll add to at this point of our conversation, when I talk about this idea of a village-like approach within our Black psychology, it also includes how we're set up. So we do have a council of elders. So we are embedding that wisdom within the centeredness of who we are. And elders, again, is not a chronological name that's given to someone. It is someone who has demonstrated their role in protecting the village, the wisdom keepers, if you will, the ones who are unearthing this type of knowledge for multiple generations to engage in and dissect and interrogate and see what belongs to them. Our students have their own student circle, which is also central within us. There's multi-generational engagement happening that we call jegnaship, which is much more complex than the limitations of mentoring, where jegnaship really is a transmission of knowledge in a bi-directional manner. I say this to say because for us, we're not necessarily countering the narrative around systemic racism, but instead we are illuminating and centering our actual essence, our wisdom, who we are. There's ways in which I'll say for me, as someone who's been trained within the academy, being a licensed clinical psychologist, having proven myself within the Western way of being, whenever I practice, I always recognized there was something missing, something was not quite right, even as I was going through as a student. And it wasn't until I looked deeply into Black psychology that I could find words for what I was feeling thinking and doing, see science and theory there, to be able to have something to draw from as I try to present the work and recognizing the limitations of my training as a Western clinical psychologist. And so I just want to say for us, that's how I would conceptualize this thing of systemic racism, that we have to move beyond just looking at which person is it lying in and critically look at the way that we approach things, our epistemological space, our nosology, how we're diagnosed, how we even conceptualize pathology within the DSM. There are multiple ways of thinking about when someone's psychological illness is emerging, then the limitations that we have in DSM, which again can be dangerous when misused because they are presumed to be real. And many times when our communities can be presenting with behaviors or presentations that have more to do with their psychospiritual illness because of the ongoing exposure to systemic racism that no one's paying attention to, including themselves. They don't have a consciousness for it, so they're embodying this. And when we then give them the wrong diagnosis, we're only perpetuating that illness and beat. And so I know that was a bit much, but I hope it was a nice jumping point for my colleagues here who will take it all the way home.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Others?
I mean, I will segue with, this happens every time we're together in a panel, like, yes, there's so many overlaps, right? I start every training I give on any multicultural topic with reminding people that communal societies, we are not the minority, we are the global majority. And yet, as Western educated people, we were all trained in a very different model, right? It's always that, like, we were all trained on weird populations.
Yes.
Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. That's not actually the world. And that is not where all our communities come from. And so how do we actually bring that wisdom, you know, as Dr. Jackson said that I love, it's about reclaiming what is the ancient wisdom that we've all had, and how do we actually integrate that into our lives in a Western society. So, you know, so much of our work is about figuring out what are the specific challenges for Asian Americans. Part of it is that we are only a population that exists in the United States. Because of political necessity, and much like Latinx people, we're sort of glommed into this group, but the lack of disaggregated data confuses people. We have the highest levels of income and education, for example, and we have the absolute lowest within AAPIs. But when you smash those data points together, we look normal curve, which means tons of needs are being left out of the research. Now, if you look at, not just as an example, we are about 6% of the US population, the fastest growing part of the population. NIH funds for research on us between 2002 and 2018. Like, take a guess. So out of 6% population, we had 0.17% of the funding. So I always tell my students, if you wonder why you don't know much about AAPI health, that's why. It's not in there, and it has real consequences for well-being. All of us in our communities can talk about disproportionate health impact of something like COVID and what that brings up. And so AAPIs do really suffer, in particular from, we have extremely bimodal population. We have no funding. We are absolutely invisible. That there have been decades of research which pathologize Black and Brown communities, and we're often absolutely invisible. We're other at best, and usually not even that. And there's so many disparities between our own community. You know, we have 5th and 6th generation people, we have brand new immigrants, we have refugees with multi-generational trauma. These are very different presentations. We have community members that we have our own differences, our South Asian community, our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities, who often sometimes are much better served in the indigenous spaces than in ours, but sometimes they're in ours. And so there's a lot of intergroup diversity that we're also trying to address. But the systemic racism basically has sort of led us to this place that the field has not ever been able to address us or even see us as a starting point. And then there's real harm in the lack of pipeline, the extremely high negative experiences that many people wind up having when they do finally seek help by sometimes well-intended but terribly misguided and not well-informed clinicians. And again, the research is still growing. And I'd really suggest people take a look at some of the great research being done on the psychological impact. For example, there was a question about military influence. That's a very complicated thing. But colonial mentality in general, right? Colonial mentality and imposter syndrome, the things that impact people who may have been raised all their lives and in generations to feel less than. And a lot of our families have been colonized, and the lingering impact of that sort of thing. Our own internalized colorism, the fact that our community has so many languages and religions as well, and that our field has been grossly unprepared to address that. So these are the things we are trying to address. We also, like many of the other orgs, have majority student members because there have been so few professionals of prominence in our field. And it gives me great hope seeing the sort of great minds coming up, and they're advocates, and they're broadly minded to think about policy and collaborating with other communities, not just AAPI issues. But also we've been dealing with sort of the larger constant microaggressions being invisibilized. And honestly, we deal, and we'll get to this later, I think, with our own intergroup understanding as well. And so those are all areas that systemic racism, historic racism for generations really has a lingering impact in the psychology and the organization.
Thank you. Others? Andrea, I saw you on click.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. Ethiopia, thanks for starting us by stating, we need to clarify that white supremacy ideology that underlies so much of the systemic racism for so long. I tried to read everything that Bell Hooks writes, and I try to read it more than once, and I've seen her speak several times. And I'm always struck with when she speaks that she starts first by labeling, like almost the first sentence of her mouth is that we live in a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal capitalist system. And there's something about her just naming it immediately that somehow settles me and grounds me. And I'm like, okay, this is a safe space. Okay, we can talk about these issues. I think, for me, I think about systems, right? My background is developmental psych. So I start thinking about like Bronfenbrenner and how do we break down those macro, meso, exo, micro systems. And so I think we started talking here today about just that we as associations exist. We exist to a great degree because we have not been well acknowledged, and our work and our peoples have not been acknowledged or celebrated, or really, their health and well-being has not been very well considered in these other psychological associations. So I think those are examples of systemic racism to start with, right? That we were already on the margins, and then, to really seek our truth in ways that were meaningful and resonant with us, we created these other spaces. But then I go back to even thinking about just in terms of education. And, when we think about the educational system within the United States, there's so many levels of systemic racism that we've all been enduring, since we started down these pathways of education, in terms of not only the content we're learning, but how we're treated in those spaces. So I always push back on the idea of the imposter syndrome, because I always say, they have always treated me in that way, right? It's not that I'm thinking that, it's how I get treated, how I, that I am more likely to be assumed to be the janitor in the building than I am to be the professor, or much less the vice provost, right? So how are we within these systems of education to even create these pipelines you know, for our communities to really feel welcomed and that they belong here, and to be able to express their cultura, their language, you know, all these other parts of themselves. And then I think the other piece for us here today is really about psychology, right? How do we think about systemic racism within psychology very specifically? And so I love that Ethiopia already named, you know, deficit models. Within Latinx psychology, we talk a lot about cultural deficit models, that there's this blaming, that there's, you know, higher rates of mental illness or educational disparities or, you know, health disparities. It's too often been blamed on the culture, that there's something wrong with the culture, or blamed on the family. You know, if we're thinking about like the collectivist systems that, you know, we live in, that's part of who we are, that are so important to us, that if there's something wrong with the child, it's blamed on, you know, that there's something wrong with the family or the culture or the language that has been holding them back. So I think those are important to name and identify early on. Those are things I think even within Latinx psychology that we still kind of struggle. How do we, you know, we've been trained often within these very Eurocentric kind of systems, and how do we peel back those layers of critiquing the theories that we were taught, and then how do we start creating our own that make more sense for us and that are going to be more healing for our communities. So for me in particular, part of my training and background, I was very, very blessed that I came through ethnic studies, and I was able to do my work within a Mexican American Studies program and continue to be affiliated with a Mexican American Studies program. And there's many other people within Latinx psychology that have that connection or that root. And so having that, you know, exposure and understanding of historical trauma and understanding socio-historical, socio-political contexts that have gone on for generations, and how that shapes and has shaped identity, how that shapes well-being, how that shapes how we interact with each other and how we interact with the larger society within the United States. I think it's been particularly critical for my own health and well-being to survive and thrive in all of these spaces, but also for how I think about my work and the spaces that we're creating within Latinx psychology. I'll stop there and looking forward to what Sean and Dee have to add.
Aisha, Wendy, anything you'd like to add?
It looks like Wendy was trying to speak, but I'm not. You're on mute if you're talking.
You're on mute, Wendy.
Sorry about that. I just, rather than be redundant of my colleagues, because again, as Helen said, where there's so much overlap in the experience of our ethnic minority communities, I would just say that I'm certainly not new on the scene as a professional, but unlike some of my more senior colleagues, I noted that when I came on scene, what I observed amongst my colleagues, and this is not intended to be by any means an offensive statement, I respect and love them dearly, but I saw psychologists who happened to be Native. And I like to try and simplify things by saying that my, similar to Dr. Romero, I didn't come through ethnic studies per se, but I came with a cultural mission and motivation, so to speak. And I came to learn how to be a Native psychologist or a Native person who also knew how to be a psychologist, and not the reverse, which is what I saw so many of my colleagues attempting to do, and almost with a sense of self-conflictedness. I'm very pleased to say I've seen that change in the last 20 years that I've been involved with the profession of psychology, but still not enough. And I couldn't help notice that one of the attendees asked a question about how military has influenced the ethics guidelines and the APA guidelines. And I will say that one of the things that we have done that we've been well noted for in the Society of Indian Psychologists is years ago we had a community action project amongst us, and we developed our own commentary to the APA ethical guidelines, and all of us we went literally through each of the guidelines and said, you know, how it would apply to our culture and our community, and how it actually didn't apply. Most of them didn't apply, and we made suggestions as to how those could work for us. Since then, that commentary has been used all throughout the US and beyond. It still is a very well-noted document, and it's something that our young ones, our pipeline, if you will. I don't like that terminology, but I can't think of another one at the moment. But that our pipeline, that we have been training them to use and to appreciate, so that instead of becoming psychologists who happen to be Native, that we are cultivating more and more Native psychologists, because by and large, the majority of Native students that come up through our ranks, you know, and this has always historically been the way it is with Native Americans, we all come up through so that we can go home and serve our own communities or another Native community. We don't have aspirations to become professionals so that we can make it big and make a name for ourselves. We come so that we can take it back home and serve our people. So we even have a different motivation for coming into the profession, unlike most Westerners who are motivated to become psychologists. And so these are some of the ways that I feel like systemic racism has impacted at least the Native peoples and Native psychologies that I'm familiar with. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kistler?
Yeah, I also don't want to be too redundant, but I'm resonating with so much of what others have said already. In particular, the ones that stand out are about the diversity within our communities. Like others have mentioned before me, we also represent folks who are refugees, recent immigrants, or maybe third or fourth generation. And there's linguistic diversity. I didn't clarify this at the top, but it's even ambiguous what region is considered the Middle East. And I've even heard criticism about the name of our organization using the term Middle East, because that is itself a colonizer's term. An alternative might have been Sawana, which is Southwest Asian and North African. But we wanted it to be recognized. So even the formation and the naming of our organization was informed by colonization. We wanted it to be meaningful to people. People already don't know what it means to be Arab and Middle Eastern. We wanted to at least be recognizable by name in mainstream United States. So for instance, I saw a question come in about my background is actually that I'm Turkish American. And so Turkey is a country that is often, but not always, defined as being Middle Eastern, depending on who you ask, but it's non-Arab. And there are other Middle Eastern countries like that as well, like Iran, that are very much represented in our organization, but also psychologists and students with that background who push back against those labels. And I wouldn't want to define that experience for other people, but I know that in my family, I've certainly seen a lot of internalized racism where there's a desire to be seen as white, even in the face of ethnic discrimination. So that is a battle that we're certainly, I think, fighting within our organization and within our communities, where you might identify differently ethnically than your twin sister, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was something else that I was thinking about. Oh, so something too that I think is important to recognize in terms of my group's battle with systemic racism in the US has to do with the conflation of racial identity with religious identity. So many folks' only awareness of Middle Eastern or Arab people is a stereotyped image of somebody who is Muslim or somebody who's an extremist. Obviously very problematic. Our group is actually, Arab Americans are predominantly Christian in the United States. And depending on the wave of immigration, folks are more likely to be Muslim or Christian, or maybe not religious at all, or some other religion. So there's a lot of religious diversity within our group too. Sometimes I even think so I'm president and one of the co-founders of our organization. And sometimes I sit and I think about, there's so much that we share as a Middle Eastern and Arab American population, but so much difference too, that it's hard to sort of stake out who are we, if not a people that have been defined by others in the US. And so that's an ongoing thing that we're grappling with. And in terms of the sort of pipeline analogy that was brought up earlier, I'm a leader in my organization as a junior faculty member because there aren't a lot of other people who have been focused on these issues ahead of me. There have been a few that have been amazing, and that's why I'm here today, but not many. So I was going to say brought up in my psychological training through primarily white supervisors and research mentors. I have not had a single supervisor who has similar identities as me. And now I'm turning around and trying to mentor other folks without having had that experience myself. And that's really common in our organization.
So Fred, if you don't mind, before we move on, can I just give a couple of comments that kind of came up that I think
Sure.
would further illustrate what we mean by the systemic racism? Because as you listen to our colleagues as they are, and as we're talking about who we are, you can see that there's been this critique in relationship to. So I give lots of shout out to the work that was done with SIP in terms of critiquing the ethics codes from their viewpoint. And yet I would submit to you that too is evidence of the systemic racism, because we're starting with someone else's ethics and trying to locate ourselves. Whereas with the Association of Black Psychologists, and I think it's important to say too, we are completely independent of APA, even though some of our members may still have membership within APA, like myself as a clinical psychologist, because that is the monopoly that's there in order for me to practice, right? But my point here is we have our own ethics that is grounded again as we are unearthing and understanding what African wisdom is. How does that translate into ethical way of being with each other and how we practice? I also want to say too, what we're hearing in this call, if you're listening critically, is the duality. This idea of being African by nature and American by nurture. And sometimes these values collide in a knowing way that can bring forth this idea of internalized racism, but many times it collides when we're not even aware in a conscious way. So one of our attendees asked about, shouldn't we have Eurocentric psychology at the table? I want to say Eurocentric psychology is at the table because we were all first born within Eurocentric psychology. And yet we came into this field, as Wendy has said, with the, I'm going to say for me, the misguided thinking that coming into psychology will help me help my people. And then once we get here, we learn that we have to first really give name, breath, and space and honor to our own indigenous wisdom, the psychologies that existed before Western psychology did. That we have to, each of us are trying to excavate that and center in a certain way, and then see how that manifests in the again, corporation of psychology in this Western way, because it controls how we practice. And I'll just also close too with one other one that came up. Excuse me. We keep saying, like when Wendy said this too, in terms of we're not psychologists, and I'll speak for me. I am not a psychologist who happens to be Black. When I say Black psychologist, it means that my psychology is in the service of my people. And so therefore, when I go back to my mission statement, if what I'm doing does not align with psychological liberation for Black folks, illumination of the spirit, this is not something separate. It's much more complex and central than religious practices, if you will. And if it's not empowering African folks, then my psychology is wrong. And I don't think that that is the starting place within our Eurocentric training model of what defines efficacy of treatment. So we're going beyond this, beyond the limitations of changing someone's behaviors, because I would submit to you, I'm taking a risk here, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I would submit to you that with good intentions, and I'm giving that a grace, with good intentions, a lot of our Western approaches are only helping my people be socialized into forever being patients in somebody's clinic. Because you can help me to sit still in the classroom, but if you're not addressing the systemic racism that I'm experiencing in that classroom, then you're just helping me to be a good patient. And I'll close here. Another example of systemic racism, if we were to poll the attendees, how many folk are professional psychologists who even knew any of us existed, who's read about any of our psychologies in their professional training program. And I want to honor someone who brought this up, that they had to learn more deeply as a person of Eurocentric background. They call themselves white here. I want to honor that they had to learn in working within Black communities and working within Hispanic, how to work within those. There was nothing taught to them that they found to be sustainable in their educational pursuit. So many of us who are woke, and I'm not going to define the term anymore for people, we are woke because we had to, in the daytime, learn APA. In the evening time, learn who we are as real people, and then find a way to reconcile that so we don't lose our minds.
I mean,
that's systemic racism.
That drop the mic moment there. That's a great segue. If you all could talk a little bit about how you have worked on some of those, and some of you have already begun to address this, work on those kinds of issues, that conflict between kind of what we're taught and who we were when we came into the programs. What kinds of things have you done? What kinds of things have you seen in the associations? How have you managed the heterogeneity within the groups you represent? Andrea?
I'll be happy to dive in.
Okay.
I'd say, we come to this work, and so many of the people that come to our association come to it with a social justice approach already. That's been part of our mission. Many of us feel that's what we do. We have a lot of folks within our association that are actively working with the Dreamers and have been great advocates related to immigration and all these related issues over the last many years, have fought hard to address educational disparities. So that's kind of, like the entry point for many of the people that do find us. But what has been interesting is once we all come together, and everyone else I think has talked about this too, our groups are so diverse. Latinx includes people from many, many nations, and sometimes even different languages, or different ways to even come at the Spanish language. So there's so much diversity within the group that once we're all together, I think over time, we've gone through these different periods where it really kind of emerges and it's like, okay, wow, as an organization, we need to address this. So one big turning point for us was related to the use of the term Latinx instead of Latina or Latino. You know, and so we had used that for a long time, Latina, Latino, with the slash in between, right? And we're like, okay, we're addressing gender. And then, you know, our communities grew and our special interest group of LGBTQ members grew. And they said, no, we're not. We are not addressing it. There are, you know, these heterosexist norms that are here and we need to address it. And there is not inclusive approaches to gender. And we need to do a better job. And so those are difficult moments, right? Within the organization, to be able to face that and address that. And, you know, we really, you know, so the proposal, the solution was to change the name to Latinx, to use the X, to represent you know, being more inclusive, and especially for our transgender members to truly feel that this was a safe space. And this is in moments where, you know, we've heard so much more attention brought to the deaths and, you know, the homicides of transgendered people of color in particular. And so, and I want to say too that maybe also the shooting at Pulse happened within that time period too. So all these things are happening. So it was very poignant for it to come up. And it was still not easy within the group for everybody to really get on board. And I would say another inflection point for us has been this year. Because as much as we, you know, really try to decenter what we've learned and try to come at it from our cultura, and, you know, our language and, you know, crossing borders and all this sort of thing. When George Floyd died and the nation and truly the entire world turned the attention to what was happening, we did not do a good job. And our members called us out on that. And I think at that point it was, you know, as in many other associations, that, you know, people were at the point too, where it was like, we don't want words anymore. You need to show us. We need action. And it's been an inflection point for us this year. And so those ideas of white supremacy, the white ideology, and the white privilege that even, you know, myself, you know, as a lighter skinned Latina, that I have benefited from, whether I was conscious of it or not, right? That's part of what does exist in these spaces, where that's the assumption, is the white is the norm. And so that's been a whole process for us this year to raise more awareness within our community. We have a fair number of Afro-Latinx members, and we're really trying to have those difficult conversations. And I think we still have a lot of growth ahead of us.
So Andrea, I just want to appreciate you for sharing that and being that real and that courageous, because we've been having these conversations in terms of the intersectionality of Africanness across a number of our ethnic psychological associations, and keeping in mind too, even within the space of African American, there is diversity. So I'm always challenging my students when they say, who are you talking about? Because that African American term can and has been used in terms of someone like myself, who is a direct descendant of the 1619 humans who were trafficked here, but it's also a term that's used by first generation African immigrants who are here. So we have to critically look at that. Systemic racism, again, would allow someone else to name us, and we accept that name as if it was our own, which is one of the ways in which Wade Nobles talked about the definition of power, to have someone else define you and you claim that as if it's your own. So even the use of language of minority, right? I am perplexed at this point in my life of how is it that I am asked to embrace and call myself a minority when no one else is walking around saying, and I'm the majority, right? So the simple fact that someone else names you and you have to claim that name in order to get access to, and no one else has to name themselves, is that systemic racism. And the way it also shows up within us is similar to what Andrea said, excuse me, is that we've been taught not to recognize one another. So we also go through this internal challenge of who's Black, who's too Black. You know, again, we've been taught as a society that what comes out of Africa is what? You know, savagery, right? And so there's a way in which there are many people of African ancestry walking who are Americans who won't claim that that's who they are because of what's been taught to them, right? And I will also say too, in this moment in space, sitting as the president of ABSI, it has been breaking my heart to have so many early career and seasoned professionals find us for the first time, who never knew the science of Black psychology is well documented for years in there. They're in tears around this. My next generation coming up, they're rocking, they're good to go. Their eyes are wide open, their voices are clear. If anything, I'm trying to keep up with them. But I'm having empathy for those who would say, with all due love, that without knowing it, they've been doing the work of the master, when they don't know who they are and they're working solely from what's been taught to us. I just want to close by saying thank you again, Andrea, for bringing that into fruition. And I would say too, and I try to say this on every platform I've been in, which is the COVID pandemic set us all down. But what it also did was it pulled back the curtain on the racial pandemic. There is no more question. The emperor wears no clothes. You know, Wizard of Oz, you get to see for real, in real time, this murder of George Floyd. And in my mind, if you are trying to justify that, you've demonstrated psychological disease. And I'm gonna also say too, when I think about our psychology, the critical questions are, what is the role of psychology for how we got here in this moment? What did we collectively miss? Systemic racism, that is the white supremacy ideology that we were so bold to think that our science was legit science. Like now, when all this is happening, I'm hearing them say, so psychology should be able to help fix all this. Well, if psychology could fix all this based on what it knows, what took you so long? So we're either here because you chose for us to be here or you withheld your science. So clearly, when I'm using the word psychology here, I'm talking about our profession under APA. And I offer it as a critique as a social scientist, not as a criticism, because this is how you've taught me to think as a social scientist. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is it the definition of insanity? So if we couldn't fix the racial unrest within our society before now, what makes us think that we have the answers at our fingertips right now? Wouldn't we say, as APA psychologists, who else needs to be in this conversation with us? It might need to be the ethnic psychological associations, not as a add-on, but as the added value. And how do you lend what you think you have as resources to our knowledge? Reverse the script. Oh, sorry. I'm in a spirited moment. One other piece too, I'm on a roll here. We talk about restorative justice. Where is the restorative justice within APA when it looks and says, here are the things that we did wrong and we need to learn from? Right? Each of our organizations have intimate examples of how mainstream Western psychology misunderstood us, misrepresented us, and added to our psychological stress before somebody decided to wake up and do something called multiculturalism, which is not the end of the conversation, but the beginning. There's still much more to be here. And for Black folks, I'm on a roll. Keep me contained here, Fred. For Black folks, I want to say too, within our healthcare industry, we diagnosed Black bodies that chose to run from being enslaved. We call that a pathology, and we named the cure, which was to beat them to the end of their life. This is our healthcare industry. This is our roots. People know about Tuskegee, but please look up the lead study that came out of Johns Hopkins. In the last 20 years, it's a replication. Why is it that someone wants to understand the impact of exposing children to high lead levels, and it's more Black and brown children in Baltimore? What is the psychology and the morality behind that? So clearly, psychology as an industry needs to step back, self-examine itself, and then ask itself critically, what can it learn from the leadership of the ethnic psychological associations? And we have to continue our own learning too, because we've been taught not to look at each other, not to embrace each other. We too have been taught to be distracted by how dark is your skin, how light, and should I be supporting, Latinx when I think about other ways in which we've had some problems, particularly within SIP, right? They want to. Our history shows that even Indians, quote, own slaves. Well, we were socialized into madness, and when you're socialized into madness, you do madness. But we have to break through our own barriers as well. I need to stop now. Thank you.
So we're going to take some questions in a bit, but I wanted to kind of transition a little bit to kind of action steps, recommendations, things that you all have done within your organizations, things you're suggesting. First, let's start with psychologists of color, and we've already started to talk about how to help negotiate the conflicts, and then we'll talk about kind of suggestions, recommendations for the profession. So things you've done, things you could recommend that you've used in your own organizations for your own clinicians and members and other psychologists of color that you could offer as suggestions to address some of these things, or?
I mean, I would say within our org, it's just a micro of the macro, right? That we have all been trained in a way that replicates a problematic oppressive system. We've had to deal with that too. All of our founders and leaders were cis, het, usually East Asian, usually US born academics. And they did great things and important things, but they also replicated certain systems of power and privilege. Whereas, for example, much like Dr. Romero said, our members now are really trying to look at systemic and policy factors and how do we really make change in our communities to meet our mission. That I think there was survival in the beginning about just trying to establish ourselves as legitimate in Western eyes. And that's not where we're at anymore. We're at a place now of like, you have no EBTs based on us, but you know what? All your EBTs are basically appropriated from Eastern wisdom. Mindfulness, CBT, that's Buddhist psychology. Like we do have our own ancient wisdom that needs to be a part of this and centered. And so reclaiming that, and also that we can't have health without coalition. We did lose some members and got some criticism. Was it 5 years ago in Colorado when we came out very strongly as our leadership aligned with Black Lives Matter during a PA convention in Colorado? And some people said, oh, we can't do politics, we can't. And it's like, we're seeing the links now between policy and community and health. And so this is really about, if we're really for promoting health and tying to sort of our ancient wisdom, then that is communal. And that includes our colleagues. And so really addressing it within ourselves, there's been some very painful conversations and growth, but clearly I think our membership now does see and want us to be part of the bigger picture. We came up in conversation that sometimes when I do DEI type trainings, I'll have cishet white participants say they feel afraid, like, are you saying that my work is obsolete? And it's like, well, the population of the world is not weird. The white, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. We've all had to learn how to code switch and accommodate a primary Western view. I know that others can also learn the ancient wisdoms and grow to accommodate that as well.
Thank you. Other, Aisha?
I just wanted to bring up for our group, there's something very simple that all of you can do. And that's to add a MENA checkbox to your intake paperwork. And then know what that means as clinicians, that there's diversity in how much people are, in terms of racial identity development, how much people are identifying or connecting with the MENA label. But if you don't ask, people will check off white or other and then feel unseen. And so along similar lines, if you're doing research, add a MENA checkbox. Without having the data on where our where our community members are, what they're struggling with, it's really hard for us who are trying to work for our communities. We're really scattered throughout the United States, and data would help us. Even if that does follow a Western ideology, you know, it's information that's valuable and needed.
Others?
A very simple, I promise you a short response here. I think first and foremost, to echo what some of my colleagues have said, it's important to be critical when you're using the term African American and recognize that that is a diverse group. So in your research, in your training, in your education, how do you, quote, unpack that and understand those components in each of their own unique histories of their culture and the centrality of how they have been impacted by systemic racism, because it may show up different in each group. Also, a strong one for me is when people are doing research studies with people of African ancestry, at this point in my life, I go directly to the references. If I don't recognize certain names, then I'm not reading it. Because, what I mean by this is when you're working with African American communities, why not interrogate African psychology? Why not read the works of Wade Noble, Cheryl Grulls, Kobe Kamban, Naeem Akbar, all of the scholars who are doing this work? In my mind, it's similar to men doing a study on women, and there's no Gilligan in there. There's no one from the Wesley Stone Center. You know, there's no feminist thinkers in there. It's the exact same thing, but yet you're saying you're doing a study on, and what you write down begins to name the narrative and name the truth because of how we do our scholarship. So we do need to be more critical, challenge ourselves, and push APA to challenge itself to make sure that our training requires learners to be exposed to different psychologies and critically consider which one is relevant where and how. So just because it's called Black psychology doesn't mean white folks can't learn from it. And I think even that name, the psychology of that is what keeps many white people from not touching, because there's this presumption that if it's Black, it must be anti-white. Let me be clear, we do not spend our time focused on speaking badly about another group. Our time is too precious. We're trying to understand who we are and center ourselves. So interrogate it, demand seeing it. Say you can't work within Black. And I'll give one last stat here, and I've mentioned it several times too. APA every year does its own demographics of its memberships, and it publishes very clearly for the last 10 plus years that 20% of all psychologists, regardless of their field, identify as people of color, 20%. Of that 20%, only 4% identify as African American or Black, 4%. And within that 4%, we have no idea what percentage even knows that Black psychology exists. Now I would ask APA to do the counter. Let's do a demographic on the communities that our students are training on for their research and their clinical practice, because I think you'll find an inverse, that something like 80% will be people of color versus 20% being Eurocentric. So that's a critical way of looking at this as well too. So those are some of the recommendations I would offer in moving forward in considerations.
Just to add a little bit to
Sure.
what everyone has already said, there was a question in the Q&A about which books to read. I know for us, if you go to our website, we do have resources and reading lists there, resources for teaching. I'm sure all the other sites do as well. So that's a great place to start. I know, I think all of us have our own journal, and that's another great place to find resources. And there are books out there on Latinx psychology and Chicano psychology and mestizo psychology. And so, you know, they're out there, and I encourage you to read them. But a good starting place, I think, is our websites.
There was a question, that's actually a nice segue into the Q&A, for SIP's response to the ethics code. Wendy, can they go through the SIP website?
I think someone posted the link in the already
Yes.
for them.
Yes, I saw that someone had posted.
Okay.
So yes, they can acquire it there.
Okay. Any final comments before I offer up some of the questions? I mean, you all have been very good at keeping track of the Q&A as we've gone through. You've actually addressed some of the questions in your comments. Any final comments before I kind of segue into 10 minutes of Q&A?
I would just like to make a final comment, and it's based on one of the comments that I read in the Q&A. Someone basically said that what we keep talking about, we keep promoting division and separation. But I would like to remind that systemic racism began with the premise of defect and deficit. And for many, many years, the solution to the defect and deficit of ethnic minorities has been assimilation. So we are recognizing our own worldviews and value systems in our psychology, not to be divisive and separatist, but to acknowledge that there is difference. And I would further carry that by saying that, you know, no, it's not about being different or separate even. I would say that there is no binary, that it is about the human experience. But thus far, the profession of psychology has done an abysmal job in recognizing that it is a human experience and instead superimposing the dominant white Western experience onto psychology as a whole and excluding all of those other things. So we are not saying that we want to be separate. Well, I'm not saying that personally. I cannot speak for my colleagues. But what I would say is I don't believe that there is a binary. And I do believe that as ethnic minorities, those of us who are culturally aware, I was raised in a traditional manner within my Native community. And I know the stories. I know the genealogies going all the way back. And I bring that to you as ancient wisdom from a very ancient civilization, in that not only, you know, Western science would call it anecdotal, but I say we have lasted the test of time and evidence. We have proven that our psychologies are valid and they work. And what needs to happen is to do away with the binary, to see them as separate, as Dr. Jackson has stated. We're not saying that this is only for natives, native psychology is only for natives. We're saying that it has been around for thousands and thousands of years, and perhaps that there is benefit that we can offer as well. But in these academic and scholarly forums, we are seldom recognized. We are seldom taken seriously and given the credibility that our histories and our wisdoms deserve. And so until those changes are acknowledged and made, you're going to continue to see division and separation. And I don't think that it's the ethnic minorities that are unaware that there is no binary. I think it's the other way around. So that's all. I'll stop.
My dear colleague, Wendy, I am just amazed at the grace you just showed in the amount of time in addressing that question, where I might simply say to my dear colleague who posed it, I would invite you, before you pose that question, to spend some time in self-reflection and reading what we've shared to try to demonstrate some level of empathy. Like in any other situation, how do you get a better sense of what you think your colleagues might be experiencing so that you can come to your own answers? Because I see this as just like sort of asking all women to think like men. But my closing remarks, as I've been staying to the point here, Fred, is I do want to also share some concrete examples of what the association has been doing in addition to the psychology that we have out there. So we have launched emotional emancipation circles because first and foremost, we would say, as I said, the myth and the lie of white superiority or white supremacist ideology and the lie of Black inferiority has touched every one of us. We're just in different places around our levels of awareness and healing in relationship to that. So it's important to understand that because when we do our emotional emancipation circles, they are not therapy. These are communal healing spaces, if you will, where we as facilitators do not even have to be a psychologist. We train the community to do this for themselves. And then the facilitated participant is an intentional language because we say we are healing with. So every time I train someone, I'm learning more and I'm dealing with my own healing of it, which is another shift away from how I'm trained as a Western person, where I'm supposed to be the expert who goes in and fixes someone else. We're starting from the place that all of us are impacted by this lie and need to heal from it and work together. This has also been our Sawabono healing circles, which we have taken into the virtual space. So when COVID-19 hit, we did not have to wait for someone to tell us that our communities are being adversely impacted. We very clearly said, how do we translate the emotional emancipation circles into a virtual space so we can do a rapid response, if you will, of cultural grounding our people when they're still looking at disparity. Our first responders are on the ground, we're hearing this, but they're still seeing the differences between how certain bodies are being treated in the midst of the COVID. So they're having to deal with that as well too. And then thirdly, we're also putting out, we have chapters all over the country and now all over the world. So I would also say too, find our local chapter, go to our website. When people keep saying, I can't find anybody, I cannot find a Black psychologist, I'm mesmerized by that. I know we're few in number, but we're here. So you have to ask yourself, where are you looking for us? And the last point, I want to give honor to our dear former past president, Dr. Robert Williams, who transitioned recently because I want to believe it was probably 1970, please forgive me if my day is off, but he wrote an open letter to all predominantly white institutions, a 10-point plan on how to do better in the training and producing effective Black psychologists. And I submit to you, many of those points are still here today that's happening in AP at this time in terms of the types of systemic oppression that graduate students are experiencing. A classic one is, and we get this call all the time, why do their chair is requiring them to have a control group when they want to do a study solely with people of African ancestry. That is still, why is that happening in 2020? That they have to justify the value of just working within their own community. So these are some of the things that we're doing. We want to continue to lift up people. Please critique the literature. Black psychology, it is worthy of everyone reading and dissecting it, and then speak to those colleagues who are not Black, who have worked within our communities, fallen in love with our people, understand our people, and learn from them. Talk to them. They'll tell you why Black psychology and the ethnic psychological associations need to exist, because they're better practitioners because of our work.
Okay. Another question that came in, how can we reimagine evidence-based practices so that they're more culturally aligned versus Euro-centered? Anybody want to take that?
I'm pacing myself.
Okay, thank you. Aisha.
Could you just restate it again?
How can we reimagine evidence-based practices so that they're more culturally aligned versus Euro-centered?
I can start with a little bit of an answer. Hopefully others will add on, but I think we can redefine what evidence means. You know, if we have qualitative data that supports that this has worked for a small, you know, N sample size, but that N is very representative of a particular group or individual's experience, then I would consider that evidence.
Other responses? Thank
I
you.
mean, that's a big thing, and there's entire conferences about it. But yes, like, what do we call evidence? Right, we have, for many of us, hundreds, if not thousands of years of types of evidence. And there are studies about, you know, there's cultural adaptations, but again, that's centering the weird model. And I think there is research really focused on from communal models and using indigenous and wisdom, like what are the interventions? And there's actually a lot of exciting work kind of going on there, and also seeing the connections, right? So I'd mentioned earlier, some powerful things with measurable evidence are rooted in ancient practices. And so how do we actually write and do more innovation in that work? You know, so like a solid example in our community was they had integrated Qigong work with depression screenings and mood disorder work with elders. You know, so communities that would not go to a traditional Western mental health psychologist, but when you integrated the body work, that culturally was congruent and made sense and created work. So there are people doing studies, and yes, we all have our journals, since that's maybe a place to start.
So evidence-based practices is a
we've
wonderful tool, but we have to critique it as well too. It is based on a bell curve model. When you look at the research, many times there's not enough people of color to have a statistical strength to look at the effectiveness of that evidence within that group. So because because it's in the bell curve place, it does miss much of what we're experiencing. And then I'll close by saying evidence-based practice, again, is focused on behavior. Many people of color, particularly in the Black community, are looking for a deeper dive, a quality of life change. And evidence-based practice does not do that.
Thank you. So we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank Drs. Sue, Kisler, Jackson, Peters, and Romero for your honesty and insight today. I think you did a great job of showing the complexity of it all and the openness to your own process. And I'd like to introduce another woman who's a highly respected leader in psychology, the CEO of the Trust, Dr. Jana Martin, who will offer some words on behalf of the Trust and lead you through the CE process. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you all. This was just magnificent. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to remain in a state of perpetual goosebumps or not, but it really was very thrilling, and the audience response has been very positive. Thank you all very, very much. We appreciate your representing your associations and your representing humanity. So thank you. We appreciate your being here.